Hello, it's Geraldine Wilkins, the Living Water Quilter and BERNINA Ambassador. We are going to look at the floral design, the leafy design for circles, for the circle ruler in the Essential Ruler Quilting Challenge. This is a beautiful design. It does require a little bit of thinking. So, boys and girls, put on your thinking caps. Let me give you a little bit of inspiration to let you know it's worth the effort. The design is so beautiful. Let's take a look. Here she is. I love this design. It's made with 3/4 circles. I've given you step by step images with arrows that you can look at if you get, should I say, confused. I know I did when I was working on the design. So it can get confusing at some point. It will take a little bit of practice, but don't get discouraged. It is worth the effort. I'm going to go with you over the whole thing step by step. Plus, you'll be able to watch the video again and again until you master the design. Okay, let's look at it step by step. We're going to break it down. So here is a step-by-step guide to the design. And again, there are individual photos with arrows to show you the stitching path. So you might want to take notes. I recommend watching this in its entirety first, then watching it again, making your own notes, and then trying to stitch it out, or maybe even draw it out with a pencil so you know which way you're going. So let's look at the design. This is the 3/4 circle. This is 3/4 this direction with 2 leaves at the end, and then it's 3/4 here with 2 leaves at the end. And the bonus is that we want to stitch this without breaking thread. So we have a little bit of backtracking, not a lot, just a little. So how do we begin? Let's first break this down into sections. We're going to start over here on the left-hand side. Can you see the 3/4 circle? This is the first step. We want to stitch this first, and you want to mark a vertical reference line. That's going to be key for ruler placement. We want to start right here. We want to put our foot at this location. Let me put the circle ruler over this. Now remember, we have 2 reference lines that we're always using, and that's the reference lines on the ruler and the reference lines that we draw on our quilt sandwich. So we're going to match the vertical reference line on the ruler with the vertical reference line on the fabric. When I do that, you can see that 1/4 inch distance between what is stitched and the edge of the ruler. So this is what we want to stitch first. How do we stitch this? Where do we begin? We begin right here. This is a 3/4 circle. Can you see that 1/4 gap right here? So from this vertical line to this horizontal line is 1/4. From this horizontal line to this vertical line is another 1/4, so that's 2. And then the third 1/4, that's a 3/4 circle. We want to close it off. We don't want to start here because then we'll have this opening. We need to stitch this closed before we start here. So the place that we start is right here. So you want to put your foot right here. With the needle down, you want to lock in a couple of stitches, and your ruler is placed exactly as you see here, with the vertical reference lines on the ruler lined up with the vertical reference line you marked on your quilt sandwich. The next thing you want to do, once the foot is there, how do we stitch this arc? Do you notice that this arc is on the opposite side of the ruler? So all we have to do is shift the ruler up until we get that arc. Now, of course, you won't see the stitching, right? You won't see it, but what you will see are a couple of things. This is where the spacing gauge If you practice using the spacing gauge in week 1, this is going to be a cinch. That's why it was important to begin the challenge learning how to use the measuring gauge. The 1/4-inch arm is our friend and is going to help us with this design. So you have to pretend that you don't see the stitching. What you do see is the vertical reference line you drew on your sandwich. You do see this horizontal line on your ruler, and you see this vertical line, vertical reference line. Notice, remember, our foot is here. Pretend your foot is here. We're bringing the ruler up because we want to stitch this arc. Once we bring this vertical line up to the foot, this horizontal reference line on the ruler should be perpendicular to our reference line that we drew on our sandwich. And one way you can tell that you will land, you want to start stitching here and go up to the top and land on the reference line you drew on the sandwich. That's where you want to stitch. You want to stitch from here to here, and you want to land right on that reference line. And you can use the 1/4-inch arm to make sure that this horizontal line is a 1/4-inch away from the reference line on the fabric. So I just bring the edge of the 1/4-inch arm rested against the ruler, and the opposite side should rest right on the reference line. When that is correct, you now can stitch from here to the reference line. That's going to give you the arc right here. Then you're going to stop. Once you stop, that's when you slide the ruler down. The foot is stopped, the needle is in the fabric, and you're going to bring the ruler over where the reference line at the top and the reference line, vertical reference lines on the ruler match the vertical reference line you marked on your sandwich. Once that happens, you will have the ruler in the right position to stitch a 3/4 circle. So remember, we started here and we moved the ruler up. We know that we want to stitch from here to the reference line on our fabric, and we can check with this horizontal line. It's a 1/4 inch away from our reference line on the fabric. Once that's correct, we stitch up to the reference line. Then we bring the ruler down. It's right next to the foot. Make sure it touches the foot in the back, and this vertical reference line and this one on the ruler line up with the reference line on your fabric. Once that's lined up, then you're going to stitch the 3/4 circle and stop here at horizontal reference line. Now our foot is resting here. We've stopped. The foot is here, the needle is down, and you want to know what to do next. The next part of the design is to close this off. We want to do this. We want to stitch a half circle. So from this to this is step number 2. I'll put this back in place, and what we want to do is stitch the arc on the opposite side. And this arc, where is it? It's on the opposite side of the ruler. So that means we want to slide the ruler over just like we did before to close off and make that leaf, right? And that's what we see here. See how it's right here. We've stitched a half circle. The foot was here. When we stitched the 3/4, our foot was here. Then we had to slide the ruler over to close off that leaf. And we're going to stitch half of a circle, stopping on this vertical reference line. Now that we've done that, we need to close off this leaf. Where is this arc? This arc is on the opposite side. So what do we want to do? We want to shift this over, right? We need that arc. And when we shift it over, what are you going to do? You're going to take this vertical reference line here and match it up with the vertical reference line on your quilt sandwich. Here you don't see the stitching, but you will know you're in the right place if you use the measuring gauge. Again, our foot is here and we want to stitch up here and we want to be accurate. We want to land right here at this intersection. Our 1/4 inch arm on our measuring gauge is going to help us do that. So when we pull the ruler down and let this end of the measuring gauge touch the edge of the ruler, this other end is where the needle will land. It will land right there at that intersection. That's what we want. And what's going to help us is referring to the reference lines on the ruler. There's multiple. We have the vertical that's lined up with the mark we put on our sandwich. We have the horizontal. Notice how this horizontal line is lining up right here. This is where our foot is. Just imagine this is where our foot is. And we're going to stitch up from here all the way up. And when we do, it's going to land right there at that intersection. And we've checked with our measuring gauge. And this is the result. This is the result right here. We had the foot right here and we wanted to come up. So let's take a look at that with the ruler. I'll put this down and you can see that 1/4 inch from here all the way around. Now we want to leave our foot here before we go to the next step. The next step is right here in between. So just pretend that these stitches are not there, that your foot is right here. And you've already closed this leaf. We've closed that off. See, it's closed here, and we left our foot at this spot. Our foot is here, and we need to make a 3/4 circle, which means we have to stitch over previous stitches, and we want to make sure we do that. What are we going to use? We're going to use the measuring gauge. And we're going to make sure that when the needle is going over the previous stitching and stitching a second time, we want it to stitch right on top. And we're going to use the spacing gauge against the edge of the ruler on this side. Then on this side, we want to make sure it is right on top of the previous stitching. When we see that all the way through, I like to ride the spacing gauge or the measuring gauge over the stitches that I'm going to stitch before I do it. If I'm going to backtrack or stitch over previous stitching, I'm going to go through the entire thing with the spacing gauge, just like you see here, to make sure I'm stitching right on top. Our foot is here. Then we're going to stitch on those previous stitches once we know the ruler is in the right place, and stop here at the horizontal reference line. This is where our foot is now. We've stopped here. Now that we're at this position, what do we have to do? We need to close off the arc so that we have 2 3/4 circles with leaves at the end. Right now, we have 1 3/4 of a circle with leaves at the end. We have a second 3/4 circle, only one has a leaf, and this one does not have a leaf. And with our ruler in this position, we know that if we want this arc, where is it? It's on the opposite side. That means we have to slide the ruler over. Our foot is here. Once this vertical line is lined up, this horizontal reference line should line up right here. That's where we know that when we stitch from here to here, it's going to end up at the right spot. And when we do that, this is what we get. We get 2 3/4 of a circle with a leaf at each end, and they're going in opposite directions. So again, step by step, you want to start here, then here, then here, and I recommend on your practice sandwich that you do exactly what I've done here, because by repetition, you will get better at figuring out the stitching path. So stitch this first, then stitch it again here, but just add one more step. Then stitch this again down here and add 2 more steps. Then do it here and add more steps, progressively adding more steps until you are stitching it continuously, one after another. So this is what we're stitching. We want this sequence. This is the sequence we want to practice over and over. And once you do, you'll be able to get this design. And now I want you to watch me stitch it. What you see me stitching is exactly the sample that we just went over. And the same thing that I'm asking you to do, I did. And that was to stitch it one step at a time and repeat the steps. Every single time you move to the next step, you want to start from the beginning and add a step. So you're repeating the steps for each one. That's going to help build your understanding of how the design works and help you to remember how to stitch it out. I'm using the BERNINA Sit Down Q20. I've marked my quilt sandwich. I'm lining it up. Now I'm shifting the ruler. I'm lining up my reference lines. I'm double checking and making sure everything is lined up before I stitch. Now I'm sliding the ruler over and I'm going to do the same thing. My vertical reference line lined up with the line on my sandwich and the reference line in the back lining up with the needle. Now I'm going to stitch the 3/4 circle. First, I stitched that one small arc to make sure I closed off the leaf. This is step number 1. You want to do that first. Then you want to repeat that and add the next step. So that's what I've done here. Now I'm adding the leaf and I'm going to check all my reference lines, making sure everything is lined up. There's the horizontal line, the vertical line, in line with the needle, and I know I'm going to stop at the vertical reference line at the bottom to stitch the half circle. That is number 2. I'm going to break thread and start from the beginning again so that I can repeat the steps and add another step. So here it is. I stitched the first arc and that's step 2. Now I'm repeating again and then I'm going to repeat it one more time. This builds your ability to understand how the stitching path works, which way to go, and what lines to use. Repetition helps us to remember how to stitch a design. And this one is a little complex. It has a lot of moving parts, but I know you can do it. If I can do it, you can do it. You see how I did it 1, 2, 3 times, always adding an additional step with each opportunity to stitch. So that's the first one. So I repeated that. I added one more step. From there to the bottom, I did the half circle. Then the one below, I just closed off the bottom leaf. You can see that in the video. One step at a time. Then I want to start a new one, repeating from the very beginning, the very first step. You want to do this. It is worth the time. The more you do it, repeat it, the more it's going to solidify the process, the stitching path order. You will gain more confidence in using the measuring gauge or spacing gauge, and you will gain more confidence on how to place the ruler. The acrylic rulers that have reference lines, horizontal, vertical, and diagonal, when you learn how to use those, you will minimize how much you have to mark. I'm using the 1/4 inch arm because I know at this point of the stitching path, I have to stitch over previous stitching. So I want to double check, and I'm going to run that measuring gauge over the area the needle is going to stitch to make sure I stitch right on top. And that's going to help me position my ruler in the right spot. So let's watch the video again. So see how I'm dragging the measuring gauge over the stitches. I'm confident now that I will stitch right on top of those previous stitches. And then I'm going to make the 3/4 circle. I'm going to stitch that and stop. I recommend you replay the video to help you, and you practice. Even if you practice with paper and pen, the stitching path, that will also help. Now, you see some threads there that have to be buried. You're doing it like I did, one step at a time. You could either just break the thread, or you can stitch in place to lock the thread and then cut it off, or bury the thread. It's up to you how you do it. It's ultimately for practice. I wanted to have a neat, clean finish so that I can demonstrate the stitching path on this sample. All the reference lines that I am checking to make sure the ruler is in the right place before I start stitching. Now, if you saw my example, which you did, you can see that sometimes I wasn't exactly where I needed to be. Sometimes when we stitch, we use the measuring gauge, the ruler's in place. Somehow during the stitching process, the ruler moves and you don't know which direction to move it back to. That's okay. That's part of the learning. And so don't get bogged down or frustrated if the ruler shifts or moves. You will get better over time. And when you're using blending thread, no one's going to notice unless you point it out to them, which I don't recommend, that you missed a couple of stitches or you weren't exactly on top of the previous stitching. Don't get overly concerned with that, okay? I'm reviewing it one more time here to show you that each step is important. Take it a step at a time. I'm showing you the stitching order, how I went step by step. And they were small incremental steps. Okay, now let's look at this one more time for more inspiration. I've just given you the step-by-step for making this leaf design.